Welcome to Eco 501, sections 1 and 2, week 6. In week 6, we will do two things. Number one, we'll make a little preview on part 2, which is an introduction to markets. By doing so, we will enlighten on what type of topics we're going to try to address in part 2 of the course after the midterm. And then we're going to look at a preview of some basic midterm topics so that you have an idea of what type of question or what type of topics may turn up in the midterm. So let's start. Share screen. Okay, so this is the spring semester 2021 and week 6 of Eco 501 and sections 1 and 2. So we're doing an introduction to markets and preview of midterm topics. Okay, the introduction to markets is divided into three components. Today, we are going to look at part 1 and part 2. Part 3, we're going to leave it for the rest of the course, but we're going to give a little preview on it. In part 1, we'll look at how we define a market. Part 2, what determines power of firms in markets. Part 3, how many types of markets are there, or how many types of markets will we be discussing? The reference, as usual, is McGuigan, page 339 to 350 for the time being. And the learning outcome of the introduction to markets is to pave a foundation for part 2 of the course. Topic 1, how is a market defined? A market, by definition, is an institutional arrangement where buyers and sellers meet to transact a good or service. We've focused on this definition throughout the course so far, but now we're going to introduce two types of markets. One is a commodity market, two is a matching market. Now, a commodity market is a place where buyers and sellers meet to transact a standardized good. For example, we want to buy a mobile phone, whether that's an Android mobile phone or an iOS mobile phone. It doesn't matter whether whichever model we want to buy. For example, you want to buy Samsung S series, their flagship series, okay? So no matter what store you go to, if you know that this store is genuine, it's an official dealer or etc., then it doesn't matter whether dealer A is selling this phone or dealer B is selling that phone. They're selling essentially the same thing in my eyes. So that's a standardized commodity. Second, I don't need to know the seller or any particular attributes of the seller. The seller also doesn't need to know me or any particular attributes of myself. Now, can you think about examples like this other than what we've just said? We made a discussion on the Samsung market, okay? And we said that the Samsung market is a standardized commodity, so I don't need to know the seller. The seller doesn't need to know anything about me. Another type of markets which we will try to address is when particular attributes or properties of standardized markets or commodity markets fail, and then we encounter what we know as matching markets. Buyers and sellers have to meet some certain conditions. For example, if your university is hiring somebody as a faculty or even as a staff, it's not that if I increase the price, I will get a good staff. I will get a good faculty, not necessarily. At the same time, I can't let anybody apply in order to attend the employment criteria. There will be certain criteria which applicants have to meet before they can apply. So this is creating one type of restriction into the entering the market. At the same time, BRAC University and the applicant, they have to know each other in a way. BRAC needs to know certain characteristics of the applicant. The applicant is also will need to know some certain characteristics of BRAC University. These are matching markets. Initially, we will start with commodity markets where standardized commodities are being transacted. Then we'll move on to matching markets. And throughout our analysis, the question was, how is a market defined? A market can be defined by the number of sellers or by the number of buyers. So market power can be that you have a selling power or a buying power. We are going to look at product markets. We are going to look at output markets. That means we are going to define the markets by the number of sellers. Now let's go to topic 2. Oops, sorry. What determines power of firms? We've defined the firms as the number of sellers. So if a group of firms can have some power in the market, they will try to exercise it. What determines this? What are the factors or determinants that determine this market power? Number one, what is the relevant market? Now, one example that we've given many times throughout this course is the neighborhood grocery shop. In Bangla, we call it Mudir Dokan. Now, the grocery shop is a very small shop, okay? And there are thousands and hundreds of groceries in any big city. So in the total industry, if we define the industry as all the number of grocery shops, then the neighborhood grocery shop is a very small player on the market. So it has literally no market share or market power. But its relevant market is how much area does it operate within? How many customers can it effectively attract? That determines its market power. So if in your alley, if you're living in an alley and there's only one grocery shop that stays up, okay, till say 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, even if there are alternatives, they may be 15-minute walk. You may not feel comfortable to walk 15 minutes at night. So that small grocery shop enjoys a certain degree of market power. Now, what we are going to do in this second part is what other factors, except this geographical location, determines a relevant market. We're going to look at that. Okay, concentrated market is a market where the market is determined or dominated by the largest four firms. The largest four firms is a specific number for. This comes from an industry definition made in the United States of America. Okay, now let me give you an example. There are many groceries in Dhanmondi, but the relevant market is dominated by few large superstores. You have Agora, okay, you have Unimart, and you have Kaji's the superstores. So these three superstores are being dominated in Shatmojid Road, but there are other grocery shops. So what we want to do is to find out what are the economic arguments, what are the geographical arguments, what are the political arguments that determines that in a relevant market, okay, say the Shatmojid Road, that caters to people in Dhanmondi, that caters to people in Mohammadpur, that caters to people in West Dhanmondi or North Dhanmondi in areas like Kolabagan. What factors determine that only a few firms will control the market, although there are many firms? The next one is A fragmented market. This is literally the opposite of the concentrated market. Again, we go to the groceries in Dhanmondi. They're fragmented. Why? Because apart from those three large stores, Meena Bazar of Kazi Group, Unimart of United, Agora, hmm, apart from these three large superstores, the rest of the groceries are fragmented. They're very small in the total area of what do you call it? Shatmojid Road, the Dhanmondi area. So, what are the factors? These are the things that we are going to look at. A consolidated market is another type of market where the relevant market, the number of firms has declined over time through acquisitions, mergers, and buyouts. A classic example is the telecom carriers in Bangladesh. In 2005 to 2010, these 5 years, Bangladesh witnessed a spurring of many telecom carriers. Some of them were local carriers. They operated in small regional pockets. Some of them, the remaining were national carriers. Today, we have only four the telecom carriers. We literally don't have those regional carriers. And these four carriers are Grameenphone, Robi, Banglalink, and our national carrier, Teletalk. So over time, what happened? Either these small firms they could not do business. They became so fragmented that they had to leave, or some company ended up buying them, which happened in case of Robi, which was Actel before it became Robi, and that was bought by some Singaporean firms and then a Malaysian firm, etc. Similar thing happened to Banglalink, but it didn't happen to Grameenphone, the largest telecom carrier, or our national carrier, Teletalk. So another example is cigarettes and tobacco. Over time, if we look at the number of cigarette companies in Bangladesh, they have also fallen. What happened? Why do these mergers happen? Why do acquisitions happen? What are the economic arguments behind that? This is what we will try to address in part two. Now, what about a threat of substitutes and complements? Threat of substitutes and complements. Okay, now let's get back to the share screen. Okay, in elasticity of demand, we discussed that substitutes and complements, they influence the elasticity of demand. That was a very big determinant that we discussed, and we discussed very intensively, because now we're going to extend that concept. What we're going to do, we're going to look at how difficult or easy is it possible for substitutes or complements to be available in a relevant market. Why do firms try to restrict the substitutes that are available, the complements also that are available? Let's give a small example. For example, the lightning cable of iPhones. Only and only that type of iPhone, that type of cable is applicable for an iPhone. And that's a complement without which you can't use the iPhone. So what's the logic? The logic is that Apple retains the ownership of this lightning cable. Only Apple produces it. Now, that in theory, this is fantastic. What are the economic determinants that imply that Apple will be able to successfully do this? Now think of substitutes. We've given a small example during the first part of our course. For example, if you go to Pizza Hut in Bangladesh and you ask for a drink, the drink will be from PepsiCo company. You're not going to get any drinks from Coca-Cola company, because Pizza Hut has signed a memorandum with PepsiCo that it will supply only their beverages and nobody else's beverage. Okay, so why these things are happening, we're going to look at in detail in this second part of the course. Now, entrance is a very important factor. How difficult or easy is it to restrict entrance into a relevant market? Let's get back to our neighborhood grocery store. In our neighborhood grocery store, a grocery store that exists two alleys down the road or before our road, they can't get access to our alley. So geographically, there is a restriction. What are the other restrictions? For example, if you come to Karwan Bazaar, you will see that it is a wholesale market in the middle of Dhaka city. Now, apparently, we just say that okay, there's a syndicate. This group of firms has a committee. They won't let anyone new firms to enter. That's that's one way of looking at the restricted market of Karwan Bazaar. Another way of looking at it is Karwan Bazaar has a capacity. It can serve a certain number of customers. It can't serve more than that in the short run. So what happens? Only a certain number of firms can survive in Karwan Bazaar. So that's an economic argument. So what we are going to look at is a threat of entry, okay, in Karwan Bazaar and how strategies are devised in order to restrict the entry. Now, we defined markets by the number of sellers. Dhaka Wasa is the water and sewerage authority in Dhaka city, just like Chittagong Wasa. And Dhaka Wasa is a monopoly. It's a single seller that provides water to entire Dhaka city, and Chittagong Wasa does the same to Chittagong city. But in the factor market, Dhaka Wasa is not a single buyer. It's a competitive buyer. It buys its inputs. For example, it buys its pumps. Many other firms also buy pumps. It hires engineers. Many other firms also hire engineers. It hires other staff like accountants, okay, MLSSS, etc. Other firms also hire these people. So Dhaka Wasa may be a monopoly in its relevant market as a seller, but it is not a monopsonist, single buyer, or does not have buying power in the factor market. So this is another issue that we want to look at. Okay, think why this happens with other firms in other markets. Next is interdependent decision making. Okay, this is also known as interdependent decision making. If there are very few firms in a relevant market, decisions cannot be taken independently. What does that mean? Whatever decision firm X makes today, it has to think about the response that firm Y will do. Because there are, say, three or four players on the market, like the telecom carriers in Bangladesh. So if Grameenphone makes a decision, it's going to launch this type of product, what responses will the other three make? The other three are also thinking like this. So when we have a market that is dominated by very few firms, okay, it's not a fragmented market like, you have some very big firms on one side, very small firms on the other. No, it's an oligopoly, as we will see later on. Then we have to think about interdependent decision making, and that becomes rival tactics. Now, just if entrance into a market is difficult for whatever reasons, which we will look at later on, then exit from the market is equally difficult. If we decide to set up a telecom industry today in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, we cannot just think, okay, tomorrow morning I'm going to leave, because it requires huge financial capacity. It requires huge technical management capacity. It also requires some legal loopholes in order to enter the market. Once we enter the market, it becomes a sunk cost. Now we're going to take the concept of sunk costs to a different level and see what happens. Finally, we have this myth that circulates that market share. We're obsessed with market shares. Okay. So how are we obsessed with market shares? We're obsessed with market shares because if I have a big market share, I think we have monopoly power. I have market power. I can control the power, etc., etc. But let's give you a simple example, a hypothetical example. Let's assume in an industry there are only 4 firms. Each firm has 25% of the market share. In this case, there is fierce competition. Nobody actually has any kind of market power. So market share, just because I have very little market share, the grocery shop in entire Dhaka city, I have a big market share within my relevant market. Again, the concept of relevant market comes back to us. And market share, another thing is market share is a static concept. Over time, market shares can change. Why they change? What are the economic arguments? What are the political arguments? What are the legal arguments? We're going to look at it as well. So this is the end of part one, where we looked at how we define a market, number one, and what determines market power. In part three, we'll make a very brief lighting on the number of markets that we're going to look at in this course. Okay, so that's the end of part one. See you all in part two. Thank you.